Catus Maximus here, this time with a review of the Milwaukee Electric Tool Company 3/8" drive ratchet. This would be considered generally speaking, a standard length ratchet. Maybe a little bit longer. Here we have an OEM Tools, and we can see here that it's a touch longer. It's a teardrop ratchet. I like what they've done where they just have, it's really pretty beefy. I do like that it is quite solid. There's quite a bit of material here. Nice teardrop handle, which is flattened. They do roll stamp the logo. It's not just laser etched. They do have a wear safety goggles, which I believe may be the first ratchet I've ever seen that has the wear safety glasses logo. It does have an on and an off laser etch, but the font for on and off is about as fine as you can possibly get. But they did do this roll stamp. What I find interesting is this font is a little bit odd because it's not like the Milwaukee logo font. You'd think they do the kind of angular electricity logo, but they didn't. And it's not even like the standard logo that they use on the back of the packaging. So they have like this kind of unique font. It's also on the bottom side of the ratchet. I think maybe when you have it laying on its back, they want you to see that. About the best I can come up with. Once again, I think the design is just fine. And it actually has this nice kind of little rounded nub on the end, which I do appreciate. It seems ratchets so much these days, like this OEM and say this Icon, really do have a pretty hard cutoff and a pretty sharp edge right there. And sometimes when you're working and you have your hand over the end of the ratchet, those types of things can pinch in. So definitely improved on that. Surprisingly enough, they don't tell you how many teeth, but they tell you a 4-degree arc swing, which would indicate this is a 90-tooth ratchet. And by the way, the switch operates and the way the anvil moves quite a bit. And then the fact that when you ratchet, we can see that the switch doesn't move at all. It's going to be a floating pawl design. They do use T10 torque screws. I like that they're a little bit larger. It seems so many ratchets these days are using just tiny little fasteners. So at least that's decent. They do screw into the head of the ratchet rather than going through the body, such as on this OEM, and then into the bottom plate. So it's not really designed for you to get rebuild kits per se, mainly because if you have this for a long time, it's possible to strip out the holes in the forged body. That's why they do the screws through, because if you ever strip out the screws, it only strips out the bottom plate, and that's part of the assembly that you'll be replacing. Other than that, seems pretty solid. Pretty solid spring in there. Pretty decent spring for the switch, so it's reasonable. It's pretty easy to flip with that long lever, and that lever does slip flush with the bottom of the ratchet body. A little bit of a depression where it sits in, so it's really a pretty low profile switch, but not something you're likely to accidentally reverse. Definitely seems like a solid unit. As far as the ball detent here, we can see that it is pretty well centered. It is pretty deep, so hopefully it won't fall out. As far as the spring tension, it's pretty good. I wouldn't say that it's like snap-on or super duty, but it's definitely not soft. It's a respectable ball detent, and I think nobody would have any issues with it holding on to sockets. About all I can really say about that. Maybe we can look at some Anvil Wobble here. It's doing okay. It's not the absolute tightest. Like this OEM here, this would be considered tight. I mean, it just barely moves at all, but it's certainly not loose. Definitely a good job there. If we look at the grinding and the fit and finish here, one of the real ways to show how symmetrical the grinding is after the forging is to look on the bottom and just see how thick the webbing is on each side of the ratchet as you follow along. To look along the head, many times ratchets will just be way overground on one side or the other, so it'll be just kind of odd and non-symmetrical. This looks pretty good, or at least the one that I have looks pretty good. Heavy ratchet, really not so bad. You know what? Let's take a look inside here. Although, quick little criticism, besides the logo, better access. I don't know what they mean by better access. Then what? I wouldn't say that it's any better access than this run-of-the-mill OEM. It's exactly the same height. The head size is probably, I mean, maybe a little bit of extra clearance down there at the bottom, but the head size is the same. Maybe a little bit more clearance than the Icon, But better access would be something like this power torque low profile head. We can see that there's a big difference in height there. Better access may be this compact head, which it turns out that the company that makes this also makes the ratchets at Lowe's. We can see that this head is actually definitely narrower and shorter. So not better access in that respect. And then here we have a micro head 3/8 ratchet, and yeah, obviously it's not going to have any chance of even coming close to this thing. So better access, I'm not exactly sure where they get that from. Let's pull out these T10s. Once again, even though they're in the ratchet body, at least they're a little bit larger than what most ratchets, 3/8 ratchet use, excuse me. Those tend to run with T8s or T9s, so definitely appreciate that. Not as easy to strip out. T10's an easier size to find. They did put Loctite on the screws, so at least that's proper. Pop this plate off here. And we see some good things in there. What do we see here? We see we see enough grease. As I said, Milwaukee, as far as their power tools are concerned, they're one of the few companies that doesn't really go shy on the grease, because they know that's one of the things that ultimately makes their tools last so long. So we have an O-ring under the bottom plate. What else are we seeing in there? It looks like we have an additional O-ring on the anvil. Looks like I'll have to get one, because this anvil has an undercut for an O-ring, but there was actually no O-ring in there. So either they're just not putting O-rings in there, or this one had been forgotten. Look at that, Paul. It does say 3/8 MW 90 tooth, so I was correct there. Let's just take a quick look at what we have. Regular old anvil. Doesn't look too bad. And that's actually kind of good news. What do we have in there? So we have a very wide, appears to be pretty wide. No, but it's just a standard pin. But that is a steel pin with the spring inside, so that's going to last longer and be a little bit better. What I do like is this seems very similar to these Icon straight 92s. Because this pawl, one of the concerns about these high tooth count ratchets is, of course, those teeth are so shallow. But Milwaukee did do a good selection here. That is a huge pawl. I mean, that thing's like 5/8 of an inch long, maybe 3/8 of an inch tall. Look at how much of the anvil it is covering at any given moment. Not too bad. That is a super huge pawl for a 90 tooth ratchet. So at least it should stand up to a fair amount of abuse. It just would have been nice if Milwaukee had included an O-ring for the anvil. It's just a little weird that they would include one around the edge of the bottom plate, but just not for that. So a little bit confusing. And yes, on the bottom plate you can see that there's a little notch around the edge to make space for that O-ring. I think I know the answer to the O-ring question. It's back drag. This ratchet has a pretty low, I wouldn't say super low, it's not gear wrench low. Gear wrenches do have pretty low back drag, but it's reasonable, certainly acceptable. It's not too heavy, but definitely not super light either. I'm thinking in testing, when they had the O-ring under the anvil, it was just too much additional friction. You know, even grease, it's still pressure, and it was just a little bit too much extra friction, causing quite a bit of back drag, and probably people were just running into loosening fasteners and then having the ratchet do the excessive back drag, so it just the bolt goes back and forth, and you got to get in there and try to hold the socket, because it already has a fair amount of, a reasonable amount of back drag without the O-ring. So I'm sure that's probably what ended up happening. You can always measure that and get a super thin O-ring. Just about every town has some place, usually a bearing place or a seal place, if not a decent hardware store, maybe even a Harbor Freight O-ring kit where you can get an O-ring and put it in there if you really want to make it totally sealed. I think the Milwaukee they probably had already manufactured a bunch, or we're just getting these are probably already made by some other brand, maybe overseas. I mean, we know it's Taiwanese, but it may be, this may not be a custom unit just for Milwaukee is what I'm saying. And may explain why, they wouldn't just make an adjustment there on the anvil just to make a little bit more clearance. But I don't think they could really done that either, because an O-ring to seal is going to have to exert some degree of pressure. So kind of unfortunate, and seems like an odd choice. Otherwise, a long video, but I thought it was interesting for Milwaukee, which is nothing but heavy duty, quote unquote. Although they've been dropping that name, that is on as many tools as it used to be. But for a lifetime warranty ratchet, I think this does respect Milwaukee's name. It's a decent design. It has a heavy body, 90 tooth with a pretty realistic sized pawl in there. This is definitely a heavy duty pawl. And even with some sealing, some nice features that aren't in all ratchets, that's for sure. Decent quality control and a decent detent. I think this Milwaukee ratchet really isn't bad. And if you're in the Milwaukee tools, or you happen to like this style teardrop handle, I think this would be more than acceptable as a ratchet. This thing's actually pretty nice for whatever I paid for. I think I paid it was a bit much. It was like $34 or something at my hardware store, but they only had the 3/8, surprisingly enough. But I may pick up the 1/4 inch to add my collection, because I kind of like this thing. Milwaukee did a good job on their 3/8 ratchet. Definitely is heavy duty. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.